David, you said something that really sparked an interest, and it has to do with the older voters who might be turned off to messaging about systemic change. I think that we also need to tackle literally decades of pro-individualistic framing, right? So individualism, thinking everything is what all meant, like men for themselves, like we're all looking out for ourselves, screw everyone else. People have stopped thinking about how intertwined we all are and how important it is that that material improvements are seen across the board, regardless of which demographic you're part of. But I do want to just bring up the fact that, you talk about senior citizens, older people who are about to retire, they're thinking about their retirement, and maybe that messaging of systemic change doesn't appeal to them. Which is why I thought it was so important for the Bernie campaign to highlight Joe Biden's attempts to cut Social Security. I don't know if this is what you guys were thinking about strategically in pushing that messaging, but we all remember how the media treated the Bernie campaign for simply bringing up Joe Biden's record on Social Security. So when we talk about strategy moving forward, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how to tackle media framing, corporate media framing moving forward, because we can have the activism, we can have a movement that's well organized, but you still need media in order to accurately depict what's going on. And we simply don't have that right now. Yes, there are independent news sources that people turn to, but they just don't have the same weight, at least not yet, that corporate media does. So how do we tackle that?
It's a great question. And let me just give you a few thoughts. I mean, one, I would go a step further and say that the media environment that we operated in this campaign allowed Joe Biden to repeatedly and explicitly lie about his record. I mean, he literally lied about his record over and over and over again. And I actually was surprised that he could pull it off with a straight face. I mean, there was moments where he said he never tried to cut Social Security. I mean, it's just absurd. It's just ridiculous. But there was an important lesson in that, which is that my belief is that Joe Biden made a calculation, and his campaign made a calculation that you can now simply just straightforwardly, without any pretense, lie about basically everything in your past, and you will likely get a pass in the media. You will not be held accountable for those kinds of lies. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, some of it's ideological. You'll certainly get more of a free pass if you're an establishment politician. You'll get more of a free pass from the establishment media. But I also think Donald Trump has so normalized pathological lying that politicians of both parties now know they can simply just straight up lie. They can say the sky is not blue. They can say, I mean, when Joe Biden said he didn't even support the bankruptcy bill. I mean, talk about just a complete and total lie on like every single level. But it was a calculation that there's no accountability system to make it clear, to really scandalize not just the support for the bankruptcy bill, but to scandalize the lying itself, because Trump has so normalized and made us so numb to lying. So that to me is the biggest problem here. That it's not just the media's ideology. It's even good people in the media, even good, legacy media outlets that are trying at times to do basic fact checking or do basic accountability journalism. They are screaming into a void, a noisy space in which the truth itself is not supreme. The truth itself does not hold the credence. The facts themselves do not hold the agency that they really need to hold in a functioning democracy. So the real question is, how do you make truth matter in our politics? How do you make Joe Biden voting for Social Security actually matter in, for instance, a Democratic primary, when before you ever get to a debate on the merits of whether his positions on Social Security are moral, you can't even get to stipulate the basic facts. I mean, think about that. That was really the problem on that issue, is that you weren't so much having a debate about whether Joe Biden was right or wrong to push cuts for Social Security. I mean, I said at one point, listen, it would be a lot more honest for him to say, look, I was for cutting Social Security because I had budget concerns and I was wrong, or look, I was right. We do need to do something about Social Security. Instead, he denied and lied about the basic premise of the facts themselves. In legal terms, in court terms, the facts were not stipulated in the case. So now, even inside the Democratic Party, much less the Republican Party and Donald Trump's pathological lying, inside the Democratic Party, we have a problem now. It has bled into the Democratic Party, where facts themselves are not necessarily stipulated so that we can have an honest debate. How do we get to a politics in which we can at least stipulate the facts before we debate them, discuss them, and argue with them? And the media has certainly a significant role to play in that. I don't have a good, straightforward answer for that, but especially after this primary, right? Where I think we're entering an era where the media itself, the legacy media that covers the day-to-day of politics, actually has internalized the fact that people are numb, that the broader population may be numb to pathological lying, and therefore we're just not even going to try to report aggressively on that lying itself. It is I mean, this is we talk about misinformation and the pumping out of propaganda to change or manipulate our elections. I mean, this is the stuff, this is one level beneath that. This is the stuff that's baked in. And I don't have a great answer for that, except to say this. The people who are running in these elections, the people who are the standard bearers in these elections, the candidates themselves, the campaigns themselves, they have to be diligent, adamant, and almost obsessive about demanding that the facts themselves be front and center, that when lies happen, they call out those lies, and they must do it over and over and over again. Think about the last debate. I'll give you one example of this. The last debate, when Biden was denying that he cut Social Security, Bernie turned to him and basically was like, are you really saying that you didn't work to cut Social Security? And what was interesting about that is that Bernie was sort of depicted as being pedantic about it in the aftermath, and obviously the sort of the media coverage was a sort of a he said she said, if you will, like a Biden said this and then Bernie said this, and we're not really going to litigate it. But the point is that in order to actually break through, it's going to have to be done over and over and over again by the candidates and the campaigns themselves and by independent media outlets. There's not going to be one silver bullet. It's basically going to have to be a war of attrition.
Yeah, I mean, Bernie was there literally having to say, like, look it up on YouTube, which was funny because that's what all of us were saying as we watched it. Mm-hmm. But my last question then, I want to actually expand out on that, and I'll bring up somebody's name, and nobody else needs to respond to that part directly. It's just a handy example to me. I always think of Joe Lockhart, who's a CNN pundit, and he does a podcast called Facts Matter, which always struck me because this guy, and I'm not trying to pick him out personally. There's tons of people like this, but he co-founded a firm called Glover Park Group and has worked with clients from Verizon to the Saudis to any number of
the NFL during the concussion scandal.
NFL during the concussion scandal. If people remember this embarrassing kick the can thing where it was going to be hip for young people to want to phase out Social Security. He's done all of that. And I don't usually do this, but I had a Twitter interaction with him once where he said something very facty, it doesn't, very something like a bastardized version of the points you just made in a much better way. And I said to him, and I don't think there's much use in really being ultra aggressive on Twitter in some ways. I mean, I am sometimes, but I didn't go at him hard. But I was just kind of dude, you don't think that the work that you have done in the PR industry for decades has set the context at which that nobody can look at facts matter with a straight face. So it's like a media problem for sure, that the legacy media has not absorbed the lessons of Trump and it is going to apply a double standard. But to me, it always struck me that, like, out of nowhere, people are so terrified by, influence campaigns and public propaganda. Well, Americans and internationally, everybody has been sort of subjected to these things. So, like, do we need to have a new conversation about the role of political consultants, how campaigns are run in that sense as well? Not in terms of regulating it, but just in terms of, like, putting it on the table, that if Joe Lockhart's going to have a Facts Matter podcast, let's look at his record on fact formation for the last couple of decades.
Well, it's my view that progressive campaigns need to be run as professionally, and I say this, not in a pejorative sense, but as ruthlessly as the campaigns that are run by the other side.
Please.
And by ruthlessly, I mean, where we focus intently and intensely on the pressure points that make the opponents uncomfortable. I have said this before. I will say it again. And I didn't say it, but the famous quote is, power concedes nothing without demand. It's an overused quote, but what it really means is we all have to understand, and the politicians, the elected officials who are purporting to represent this movement need to understand that the establishment of the Democratic Party and the larger political establishment that owns this democracy will not give up power. It will not concede power. That power will have to be taken from that establishment. And the point of saying that is that means that campaigns need to be run in ways that understand that this is a power struggle, that this is not a process in which the opponents are simply going to nicely hand over the power that they have just through nice decorum and nice etiquette. So I think we're only now moving into an era in which perhaps progressives really, the progressive movement here is what I'm referring to, really fully from top to bottom understands that. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't areas in which we can work collaboratively with people in the establishment. I think there's a lot of overlap in this election, for instance, where the progressive movement and the Democratic Party establishment actually can work together. Expanding the franchise, vote by mail, to make sure that the coronavirus situation doesn't shut down the election. Good example of that, right? It doesn't mean that the establishment always has to be the central enemy at all times on every policy. But it does mean that over the long-term future, that establishment is not just going to hand over its power, that we are actually we, the movement, and we actually, the broad population that has been economically and politically disenfranchised, is in a battle, a power struggle with the people who have that power. And that attitude change, change or realization should inform the way we run these campaigns, so that we're not deluding ourselves into thinking that if we're just nicer, if we're just more, use more unity rhetoric, if we're have better etiquette, that all of a sudden that establishment's going to concede power. Joe Lockhart is a good example. Joe Lockhart represents the corporate establishment. That's literally in his bio, that what he does is advise corporations and CEOs. Joe Lockhart may scream about civility online or the need for decency in politics. I don't care how civil you are to a person like Joe Lockhart. I don't care how nice you are to a person like Joe Lockhart. That is a person who represents corporate power. That corporate power is not going to be handed over to us by being nice to people like Joe Lockhart. It is going to have to be taken through democratic, small d democratic processes, winning elections, organizing drives in workplaces, and building an independent media that can actually inform our democracy on the basic issues and the basic facts, regardless of whether it makes people in power uncomfortable.
That's great to know. I just want to say, because I'm relieved that some of my Elizabeth Warren tweets are not the reason why we lost. So that's helpful too.
David, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with us. We really appreciate it and genuinely enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
All right.
All right.